for a very long period of time, plus they don't want any part of it. Last year, this committee worked to significantly strengthen 215 oversight with the adoption of 20 major reforms.
We will leave the last 30 minutes of this hearing to return to live coverage of the Senate now. In just a few minutes, lawmakers will hold a vote on final passage of the flood insurance bill. We could also see work on the House-passed Farm Bill. Live now to the floor of the U.S. Senate.
Conference report to accompany H.R. 2642. The Committee of the Conference of the Disagreeing Votes of the two Houses on the amendment of the House and the amendment of the Senate to the bill H.R. 2642 to provide for the reform and continuation of agriculture and other programs of the Department of Agriculture and so forth and for other purposes, having met, have agreed that the House recede from its amendment to the amendment of the Senate and agreed to the same with an amendment, and the Senate agreed to the same, signed by a majority of all the conferees on the part of both Houses.
Madam President.
Is there objection to proceeding with the amendment? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I have a cloture motion I ask to be reported.
The clerk will report the cloture motion. The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the conference report to accompany H.R. 2642, the Federal Agricultural Reform and Risk Management Act, signed by 17 senators as follows.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to reading the names be waived.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum required under Rule 22 be waived, that the cloture vote occur at 5:30 Monday, February 3rd. That if cloture is invoked, there will be 20 minutes remaining post-cloture at 2:15 Tuesday, February 4th, to be equally divided between the two leaders of the designees. That upon the use or yielding back of that time, all post-closure time be considered expired. The Senate proceed to vote on adoption of the conference report.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I now ask consent that we resume consideration of S. 1926.
Without objection. Without objection. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote on passage of S. 1926. Who yields time?
Madam President.
The Senator from Georgia.
Madam President, I'll be brief in our 1 minute just to express my thanks to Senator Menendez from New Jersey, Senator Landrieu, Senator Vitter, and all those that came together to put together a great bill for the people of the United States of America with regard to federal flood insurance. It was a team effort. It was a bipartisan effort. It was an equally divided effort between the Republicans and the Democrats. I urge everybody to vote for the bill and again thank the Senator from New Jersey for his cooperation.
Madam President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Let me first say I want to urge all of our colleagues to cast a yes vote on the final passage of the Homeowners Flood Insurance Act. I think this has been an excellent week for the Senate. We're able to break through what sometimes is a partisan gridlock and far too often pervades this auspicious chamber, and we've had an honest and open debate on this issue that's critical to the American people. We've had a respectable debate on good faith amendments that were germane to the bill and live up to the ideals of the Senate, and now we're poised to pass a critical piece of legislation which I believe overwhelming bipartisan support, which will provide real relief to millions of American families. I want to thank all of our co-sponsors and their staffs, including a very large list of Republican colleagues who support the bill, and I particularly want to thank my lead Republican co-sponsor, Senator Isakson, for his efforts and the partnership on this issue and many others. I've had the pleasure to work with Senator Isakson on a number of issues and have come to respect his honesty and his desire to come together and get things done regardless of the issue. I think he's one of the most well-respected members of the Senate, and together, working with our colleagues, I think we're poised to give some real relief to families and send a strong message to the House that we hope that they will.
Time has expired.
As for the yeas and nays.
The question occurs.
The question occurs.
On the passage of S. 1926 as amended.
On the passage of S. 1926 as amended.
Is there a sufficient second?
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Aya, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons.
You called me first, couldn't find me.
Mr. Corker.
Okay. Yeah, well,
Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo.
yeah.
Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Senator Bozeman. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Boxer, Burr, Cardin, Casey, Chambliss, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, Wicker, Wyden. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Bozeman, Carper, Coates, Coburn, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Fisher, Flake, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Inhofe, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Sessions, Thune, Toomey. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, no.
Anyone wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 67, the nays are 32, and the bill is, as amended, is passed.
Madam President.
Senator from Maryland.
Move to reconsider. Lay on the table.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Senator from Maryland.
I would ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President.
Senate will come to order.
Madam President, on Tuesday evening, President Obama, in his State of the Union address, made the point that America must be the land of opportunity for all.
And he acknowledged, quite frankly, that for many families in this country, the American dream is just that, a dream. And many families have lost hope that their children or grandchildren will be able to achieve the American dream. President Obama made the point that if we all work together, that the outlook for this country is strong, and that we can make not only the American dream something that people can continue to believe, but can become a reality for more and more American families. But he also expressed the reality of where we are, and the facts indicate that intergenerational mobility, that is, a child born into poverty, their ability to move up the economic ladder, hasn't changed in the last several decades. The American dream has become just that for too many families. Let me just point out some of the income disparity that we've seen grow in the United States. And some of this is very understandable. It's understandable that people get paid differently. Some people work a lot harder. Some people come up with an incredibly ingenious way of doing something. That's the American way of developing new technologies. People are willing to take risks, greater risks than others. And yes, the reward will be greater. So we do expect and we do appreciate and we do look up to people who can be very successful in our economic system. But what is not understandable is how we've seen a growth in the income disparities among Americans during good times and bad times. Between 1979 and 2007, the top 1% in income in America saw their income go up 275%, whereas the three middle quintiles, this is what we usually consider to be the middle class, those from 20% to 80%, they saw their income go up only 40%. Now, this is a period of economic growth in this country from 1979. To see your income only go up 40%, whereas the wealthiest are going up close to 300%, that should be of concern to the people of this country. Well, as we all know, in 2007, we went through a recession. And since that recession, median income in this country has declined. It went down 31% during the recession. But for the wealthiest, it actually went up. It went up 31% for the wealthiest. The median income went down for most Americans. So we have a problem. During good times, we're seeing income wealth get larger. In bad times, we see wealthy people protected, whereas middle-income families are doing worse. We even have what's known as the birth lottery. If you're born into poverty, we know you have a hard time getting out of poverty today. But if you are in certain communities, it's even much more difficult. So President Obama was right to concentrate on America as opportunity for all. How can we get a growing middle class in this country? What can we do to help everyone do better in our country? Many countries are doing much better than we are. This disparity strikes at the heart of who we are as a nation. We believe that if you work hard, you play according to the rules, you should be able to succeed in this country. For too many families, that's not the reality. What can we do to make a difference? I know we've had a lot of talk as to what we can do to help in that regard, what we can do to make it better. It's very important to do that for the values of our country. It's important for the families that are affected, but it's also important for our economy. So yes, we need to increase opportunity for middle-income families so more people can live the American dream. We need to do that because that's what we stand for as a country, and that's our values. But we also need to do this for our economy. It's very interesting that if the companies that are making money today and are ready to invest in growth of our economy, they need consumers. They need people who will buy the automobiles. They need people who will eat in the restaurants. They need people who will go on vacations. They need people who will buy the clothing in the stores. And if they don't have the income to do it, they don't buy the products, our economy doesn't grow. So a growing middle class is critically important for a growing economy. So what steps can we take? First, I want to say we've already taken one very important step with the passage of the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act dealt with health care costs. And we've seen a reduction in the growth rate of health care costs over the last couple of years. It's a major cost in among American families. It's been growing and growing every year. Well, we're now starting to see a slowdown in that. Why? Because we're dealing with health delivery. We're trying to make the healthcare system more efficient by looking at the total care of an individual rather than just looking at a specific episode. We're trying to reduce readmissions. We're dealing with healthy lifestyles. The Affordable Care Act rewards all of those issues. And we make quality, affordable insurance available to all Americans. Last year, nearly 2 million families had to go through bankruptcy in America because of health care costs. And last year, it was estimated that 56 million American families struggled to pay their medical bills. So this is an issue that we really need to look at from the point of view of helping middle-income families. Alan Kruger, the economist, observed, we help, and I'm quoting, we help the middle class and those struggling to get into the middle class by lowering the growth of health care costs, by preventing those with pre-existing conditions from being denied health insurance coverage, by creating exchanges for small businesses and lowering income families to obtain health insurance at competitive rates, and providing tax subsidies to small businesses and lower income workers to purchase insurance. So the point that Mr. Kruger was making is that when we eliminate pre-existing conditions, when we have health exchanges that allow individuals and small businesses to be able to get competitive rates, we are helping the middle-income growth in America. Well, there's a lot more we need to do in addition to just the health care problems we have in this country. The President mentioned during his State of the Union address that America needs a pay raise. Americans need a pay raise. And I couldn't agree with him more. In 1968, and Madam President, that was 46 years ago, the minimum wage in this country was set at $1.60 per hour. If you adjust that for inflation, the minimum wage today would be $10.77. The minimum wage in America is not $10.77. It's $7.25 per hour. The tip employee minimum wage is $2.13. For a full-time worker at the minimum wage, the $7.25 per hour wage, would be making a little over $15,000 a year. You cannot support your family on $15,000 a year. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition has done a study, and there's not a single state in the Union where you can afford affordable housing, and they define that as a two-bedroom housing unit on the rental market. There isn't a single state in the nation where the $15,000 a year income allows you to be able to afford that housing for your family. So, Madam President, the American dream is on life support. We need to do more about that. One thing we can easily do in this Congress this year is raise the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. We also need to adjust it for inflation. And what does that mean? We've only adjusted minimum wage, I think, 3 times in the last 30-some years. We need to have the minimum wage keep up with inflation. And that way we don't have to deal with abrupt increases. We'll have gentle increases, which I think is better for our economy to start off with, but it also keeps the minimum wage as what we want to set it at. It doesn't erode the year after we've passed it. I think that makes sense. Let me just dispel some of the myths about the minimum wage. I hear frequently, well, we're only talking about teenagers or those in their early 20s. There's their first job. You know, it's not so serious. Well, let's look at the facts. The average age of a person earning minimum wage is 35. The median age is 31. 36% are over 40 years of age, 40 years of age or older. 56% are women. Now, only 50% of our workforce is women, but at the minimum wage, it's much more likely to be a woman than a man earning the minimum wage. 28% of the people who are earning the minimum wage have children. These are families trying to live on minimum wage. Increasing the minimum wage will help to grow the middle class. It will help our economy. A $10.10 per hour increase in minimum wage will generate about $34 billion in wages into our economy. $34 billion. You know what that means for the local businesses that are there? You know what that means for our economy? I know our economy is on the right path right now, but we need to help it along. We don't have enough jobs in America. $35 billion will allow that local supermarket or that restaurant or that business owner to hire some more people, creating more jobs, helping our economy continue to grow. People who work full-time shouldn't live in poverty. Today, with the current minimum wage, and even with the tax credits we have available, most individuals will live in poverty. That's unacceptable. At $10.10 per hour, we will be above the poverty line with the tax credits. That's what we should be. Play according to rules, should be able to succeed. Work 40 hours a week, shouldn't have to live in poverty. Not in the United States of America. And Americans get this. Polls have shown over and over again that the overwhelming majority of Americans support a reasonable adjustment in the minimum wage. The Gallup poll had it at 76% of Americans believe that Congress should pass an increase in the minimum wage. President Obama has already taken action, and I applaud him for that. He's going to be signing an executive order. So those people who are federal workers, from a contractor, a federal contract worker, someone who's getting money from the federal government, hires people, they're going to have to pay the minimum of the $10.10 minimum wage. We should do the same for all workers in this country, and we have it in our power to do it. Now, there's a lot of other things that the President mentioned. There are many other issues that I think we need to deal with for our agenda for a growing middle class. We clearly need to do a much better job in education. Education is really the key for opportunity in America. It really does open up doors. We want to create jobs, but we need people who are trained to be competitive for these jobs, particularly in a global economy. So we need people trained. And the President is right to say it starts at a very early age, pre-K. And the pre-K through 12, we have to insist quality education. We have some great schools in America, but not all children have access to those good schools. So we need to do a better job in educating our children in all fields. All fields. STEM's very important, but so is the humanities, so is the arts. We've got to do a better job in our pre-K through 12. And in higher education, we've got to make it much more affordable. How do you expect to get a growing middle class when so many families are looking at tens of thousands of dollars of educational bills that they don't have no idea how they're going to be able to pay for? Or a young worker saddled with these large debts affecting what career they're going to go into. So we've got to invest in quality higher education, but also affordable higher education. That's why it's important for us to reauthorize the Higher Education Act to demand that there be value given for the money that we invest in higher education, but that we also make it affordable for American families. We need a modern infrastructure, and the President talked about that. Good jobs go to where there are good roads and good bridges and good transit systems. Almost any morning today, try to get around this region, and you know how important the transit system is in the Washington area. In my own state, I know that we have 3 major transit projects that we need to get funded so people don't spend hours in gridlock in the morning. We need modern infrastructure. In my own state of Maryland, we've had tremendous problems with our water infrastructure. We've had roads flooded, and we've had homes damaged. We need to rebuild our water infrastructure. We want to make sure people get clean, safe drinking water, and that we take care of our water infrastructure in America. We need a modern energy grid in this country, which is critically important for economic growth. As President Obama said, good jobs go to where there's good infrastructure, and we need to do a better job with the infrastructure in America. We'll have a chance again in this Congress. We have the reauthorization of the Surface Transportation Act. We have, I hope, a water bill will get done for some of our water projects. It's in conference today. That's things we can do that will help grow a middle class. We've got to invest in research, and I think one of the lines that got the biggest applause in the State of the Union address when he said, we got to restore the cuts that we made, that we should never have made, to the basic research. The National Institutes of Health are located, headquartered in my state. They're in every state, but they're headquartered in Maryland. The work they do is critically important to economic growth in our country. We've got to invest in research. We need a progressive tax structure. More and more economists are telling us that you can have a growing middle class. You need the revenues. We've got to pay our bills. We don't want the debt. But you got to do it in a way that's fair and that rewards the middle class. Middle class families don't take advantage of these tax breaks, these tax loopholes. At a minimum, we got to close those tax loopholes, and I agree with the President in that regard. The President also mentioned in the State of the Union address that for a growing middle class, we want to make sure they have a job. We want to make sure they're trained for that job. We want to make sure that they get rewarded for that job with fair wages. And we also want to make sure they have a secure retirement. And we're not doing enough today to make sure Americans have a secure retirement. We got to save more as a nation. The best way to save is through retirement savings. And we can all come together to do more. This is not a partisan issue. We should be able to do this together. Let me just end on a quote from a former president, Theodore Roosevelt. When Theodore Roosevelt said, "This country will not be a permanently good place for any of us to live in unless we make it a reasonably good place for all of us to live in." I think that was what President Obama was talking about when he said opportunity for all. That's what this nation stands for. And we have all the reason to believe that we can accomplish this for the people of America. But we need to work together with the President to implement common sense changes so that we can have a growing middle class in America. With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Republican whip.
Madam President, earlier this month, the Quinnipiac poll asked voters what the top priority they had was for President Obama and members of Congress in 2014. 18% said health care. 16% said jobs and unemployment. 15% said the economy in general. Only 1% of the voters said income inequality. In other words, 99% of the voters in this Quinnipiac poll felt that income inequality should not be our top priority, and then rather they would like for us to focus on not just the symptoms of the problem, but the root causes. How do we get people back to work? How do we increase upward income mobility, letting people climb that ladder of success so that they can pursue their own American dream? And yet the most significant economic proposal President Obama mentioned in his State of the Union was aimed not at fixing our health care system, creating jobs or boosting growth, but rather at this idea of reducing income inequality. The American people are pretty darn smart, and they understand that we need to grow the size of the pie, not just cut the pie up into different pieces. And the best way to do that is by guaranteeing that people have the opportunity to pursue their dreams, not some socialistic notion of let's slice the pie up here in Washington, D.C. No one does better under that kind of system. But I also mentioned the President's, apparently his signature proposal for addressing income inequality, and that is by raising the minimum wage. I heard my friend from Maryland talking about the minimum wage as if Washington can wave a magic wand and say, you, Mr. Employer, you, Madam Employer, you're going to now start paying your employees 40% more than you did yesterday because the big bad federal government orders you to do so. And they act as if that would have no other consequences or costs. Well, as I mentioned yesterday, there are studies that have been done that indicate that if you raise the minimum wage up to $10.10, as the President argued for, that it could well dislocate as many as several hundred thousands of people from their existing jobs. So let's just think about this for a minute. If a small employer has a business, let's say they have a fast food restaurant. I've got hundreds of them, maybe thousands of them in my state. And an employer is worried about bringing money in the front door from selling their product, selling the food at their fast food restaurant, but they know they're going to have certain expenses. Some of that is the materials or the food that they put together. Some of it's their overhead, like electricity and energy. But a significant part of that is going to be the cost of labor, paying people to work there. So if you automatically tell that small employer, that fast food restaurant, instead of $7 an hour, you now have to pay 40% more, what is that going to do to their ability not only to hire and grow their business, but to maintain their current level of employment? Well, perhaps there is a reason why the President has counterintuitively decided to come up with some sort of feel-good, quick patch like the minimum wage, which actually would make things worse. Perhaps he's decided to focus on this because it may be he's just feeling a little bit guilty about his record over the last 4 and 5 years. According to the New York Times, hardly a bastion of conservative propaganda, the trend of rising inequality, quote, appears to have accelerated under the Obama administration, close quote. The President, and I'll get to this in a moment, appeared to concede that much in his State of the Union speech. But in fact, one measure of the income gap suggests the inequality of wages has increased 4 times faster under President Obama than it did under the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush. The best thing we can do to support upward mobility is not to address the symptom, lower wages, but to address the root cause and expand the economy and jobs and to give people the tools they need to qualify for good, high-paying jobs for which they don't have the job skills currently. And we know that a lot of our community colleges, like the one I visited last week in Houston, San Jacinto College, does a really good job of training people for the skills they need in order to qualify for good, high-paying jobs. And that's where we ought to focus our effort, not by the federal government trying to fix prices when it comes to wages and actually end up making things worse. Unfortunately, the President seems incapable of embracing an economic strategy that doesn't involve more government, and particularly more government spending and more government control over the private sector. My constituents in Texas tell me one reason that they're feeling uncertain about the future and the economy, particularly if they're a business owner, is they don't know what kind of new taxes, they don't know what kind of new regulation, they don't know what new financial burden like Obamacare will be thrust down on them that will totally change their business model and cause them to go bankrupt, perhaps because they hadn't counted on what the federal government might do to them as opposed to the market. But we've tried the President's approach: big government, spending, stimulus spending, and the like. And that's a big reason why we're suffering through the slowest economic recovery since the Great Depression and the highest and longest period of high unemployment since that same time. Even when the President seems to be supporting a fresh approach, he's actually selling old ideas in a new package. I remember the President talking, for example, about tax reform. He called for abolishing loopholes in the tax code and simultaneously lowering the marginal rates. Well, that sounds pretty good. I would support that. And I believe we could get a strong bipartisan support for that kind of tax reform. Lower the rates, cut out a lot of the underbrush, the tax expenditures. They're much like the President's own bipartisan Fiscal Commission and Debt Commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, recommended in December of 2010. But what did the President do when his own bipartisan Fiscal Commission reported to him a bipartisan plan to deal with the debt and to get the economy moving again? Well, he ignored it. He walked away from it. Well, unfortunately, the President, when he talks about tax reform, is actually talking about a way to raise taxes or to raise revenue. And this is what I mean by that. He talks about tax reform as a vehicle for a tax increase, even though he has already raised hardworking American families' taxes by $1.7 trillion while he has been president. So the American people are plenty smart, and they can figure out that if you're going to eliminate their deductions and tax credits and the like, that you're going to have to bring down their rate, or else it'll actually be a tax increase. Well, there's another good reason why we need to do the kind of tax reform that I'm talking about, and that occasionally the President talks about when he's talking about pro-growth tax reform, and that is to make it revenue neutral, to bring down the rates, which will encourage people to invest, create jobs, because they know the incentives will be there for them. They'll be able to reap the fruits of their labor and of their risk. And that's the kind of tax reform both political parties supported back in 1986, and the kind of tax reform we need to do again. But sadly, the President and the Majority Leader have chosen to hijack this wonderful idea of tax reform for while demanding another trillion-dollar tax increase. Meanwhile, the President wants to use a tax code to pick winners and losers by discriminating against certain industries and increasing government subsidies to others. I heard him talk about the oil and gas industry again. This is actually one of the brightest sectors of the economy, but the President wants to take the goose that laid the golden egg and to burden it with additional regulations and taxes. Truth be known, 80% of the tax benefits that flow to the energy sector flow to the so-called green energy sector, many of which I think are important, but we have to be realistic. We're actually writing them a check as opposed to the millions and millions and literally hundreds of millions of dollars of tax revenue generated from the oil and gas industry. And if there's one sector of the energy economy that is creating more jobs and opportunity and provides more chance for us to reduce our imports from dangerous parts of the world, it's our domestic energy sector. But the President wants to raise their taxes. So the President acknowledged on Tuesday night what he called average wages, what has happened during his 5-year tenure as President. He said average wages have barely budged, inequality has deepened, and upward mobility has stalled. In other words, he agrees with the assessment of the New York Times. The problem is the solution to that condition would actually make things worse and not better. So I actually agree with the President's assessment. During his 5 years as President, average wages have barely budged, inequality has deepened, and upward mobility has stalled. But why in the world would we want to add another trillion-dollar tax burden on an economy and on the productive sector of our economy at a time when average wages have barely budged, inequality has deepened, and upward mobility has stalled? Why in the world would we jeopardize the renaissance in American oil and gas production, which represents one of our few economic bright spots? And why in the world would the President continue to reject the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada, which would create thousands of well-paying jobs? You'll notice, by the way, Madam President, that President Obama said nothing, zero, zip, nada, about the Keystone XL pipeline in his State of the Union. It really is just mind-boggling. I'd like to close by noting something the President said about health care, and this is another interesting thing in his State of the Union speech. It was about 40 minutes into his speech before he even mentioned health care, when that is the big looming 800-pound gorilla in the room. People are anxious about this rollout of Obamacare. First the website, then the cancellations, then the sticker shock. People are worried about it, but the President waited 40 minutes into his State of the Union before even addressing it. But here's what the President said to congressional Republicans. He said, if you have specific plans to cut costs, cover more people, increase choice, tell America what you do differently. You know, the problem is, Madam President, we've been telling the President that since 2009, but he has refused to listen. He's refused to listen, and he's still refusing to listen. So the President went on to say that Republicans owe it to the American people to say what they're for, not just what they're against. I agree with the President. And we have, and continue to do so, but he continues not to listen. Republicans have been offering health care alternatives for at least the last 5 years. Most recently, just this last week, or just earlier this week, 3 of my colleagues, Senator Hatch, Senator Burr, Senator Coburn, introduced a health reform blueprint that would reduce costs, expand quality insurance coverage, and improve patient access to doctors and hospitals. If President Obama wasn't aware of this, then perhaps he needs to spend a little bit more time outside the White House and the Democratic echo chamber and actually engage with members of this side of the aisle in serious discussions. It's really easy to knock down a straw man, but only when it's not true. But given the massive problems with Obamacare, not just with the website, not just with the cancellations, not just with the sticker shock, not just with the fact that you can't keep your doctor if you like them, but given all the massive problems with the implementation of Obamacare, along with all of the massive problems still plaguing our economy and stalling wages, it's time for the President to show some real leadership. And you know, the way he could show that leadership is simply to get in a room with members of the opposing party and to say, you know, let's figure this out. Let me just say that this plan or this blueprint that Senator Coburn, Burr, and Hatch have introduced is just one of dozens of ideas that would actually bring down the cost of health insurance, which would make it more affordable, which means more people could buy it and more people would get covered. But the difference between our approach and the President's approach under Obamacare is under Obamacare, the government gets to choose. Under our alternatives, you and your family get to choose what is best for you. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Georgia.
Madam President, I rise today to express my support for the Agricultural Act of 2014, which is commonly known as the Farm Bill. It's been quite a journey over the past